What would you do if you discovered that the town you've always called home was built on a foundation of secrets so disturbing they could tear apart generations of families? What if the respected figures who shaped your community's history were orchestrating a dark conspiracy beneath the veneer of Southern hospitality? In the autumn of 1878, as Reconstruction efforts struggled to heal the deep wounds of the Civil War across Alabama, a discovery in the small town of Hickory Falls would unearth horrors that had nothing to do with the recent conflict and everything to do with one man's twisted obsession with bloodlines and legacy. The events that unfolded would expose 30 years of arranged marriages, manipulation, and a meticulously documented breeding program disguised as Southern tradition and family values. Hickory Falls sits nestled in the foothills of northern Alabama, established in 1843 by Thaddeus Montgomery, a wealthy landowner who moved west from Virginia with a vision of creating what he called a perfect community. Historical records show that Montgomery arrived with substantial capital from family cotton plantations, purchased 5,000 acres of land, and began recruiting families to settle in his new town. What those records failed to mention was Montgomery's obsession with eugenics and bloodlines, concepts that wouldn't become mainstream scientific discussion until decades later. I remember my grandfather speaking of Thaddeus Montgomery with a reverence reserved only for prophets, wrote Elijah Cooper in his 1893 memoir, Recollections of Hickory Falls. He would say that Montgomery had the bearing of royalty and the vision of a general. When he spoke, people listened not out of fear, but out of a strange sense that his words carried the weight of destiny. For the first 2 decades, Hickory Falls thrived under Montgomery's leadership. The town grew to almost 800 residents, with a robust economy centered around timber and agriculture. Montgomery established the town's first school, church and courthouse. Historical archives from the period show a community that appeared to be a model of Southern progress and Christian values. Yet beneath this facade of prosperity lay a calculated plan that would only come to light 35 years after the town's founding. The truth began to emerge on September 12, 1878, when Sheriff William Hargrove was called to investigate a disturbance at the Montgomery estate following the Patriarch's death at the age of 73. Thaddeus Montgomery had passed away 3 days earlier from what appeared to be natural causes, leaving behind no direct heirs despite 4 marriages, all to women who had died under what would later be deemed suspicious circumstances. I arrived at the Montgomery house around midday, Sheriff Hargrove wrote in his official report, preserved in the Alabama State Archives. The housekeeper, a colored woman named Bessie May, was in a state of considerable distress. She claimed to have heard noises coming from the deceased's study the night before, despite the house being locked and empty, save for herself. Upon inspection of the study, I noticed that several books had been removed from the shelves, and a section of the wood paneling along the eastern wall appeared loose. What Sheriff Hargrove discovered behind that paneling would change the understanding of Hickory Falls forever. A hidden door led to a previously unknown basement chamber beneath the study. The space, approximately 15 by 20 feet, contained floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound ledgers, medical instruments, anatomical drawings, and glass jars containing preserved specimens that would later be identified as human tissue samples. The records kept by Thaddeus, Montgomery revealed a methodical plan spanning 3 decades to engineer what he called the superior Southern bloodline. The ledgers contained detailed genealogies of every family in Hickory Falls, with notations on physical characteristics, temperament, intelligence, and what Montgomery termed breeding suitability. Most disturbing were his meticulous records of arranged marriages he had orchestrated between families, often using his influence as town founder, and his control over property deeds, business loans, and social standing to manipulate young people into unions that served his eugenic vision. I began reading the ledgers around midnight, wrote Deputy Thomas Reynolds in correspondence to his brother, dated September 14, 1878. I could not put them down despite the growing sickness in my stomach. He had pages for every family in town, Tom. Pages where he documented their physical features like they were prized cattle. Notes about which families should be bred together to produce certain traits. And the most terrible thing was realizing how many marriages in town over the years had followed exactly what was written in these books. Marriages we all attended, celebrated even. The investigation revealed that Montgomery had developed an elaborate point system to rank families and individuals based on what he considered desirable traits: height, facial symmetry, intelligence, and what he called moral fiber. He maintained separate records of health issues that he termed defects to be bred out of the community. His writings revealed a disturbing philosophy, combining elements of scientific racism, primitive understanding of genetics, and a quasi-religious belief that he was creating a superior breed of Anglo-Saxon stock that would eventually produce what he termed the perfect Southern aristocracy. Most of we chilling were Montgomery's notes about his own role in the community. He referred to himself as the shepherd and wrote extensively about his methods for influencing the town's social dynamics. Church gatherings, town festivals, and community events were all designed with specific pairings in mind. Young people from families he deemed compatible were intentionally brought together through manipulated social circumstances, while those he considered unsuitable were often provided opportunities to leave town through scholarships, job offers, or other incentives. I have discovered through careful study and divine inspiration that bloodlines must be cultivated like fine gardens, Montgomery wrote in a journal dated 1856. The common practice of allowing young people to choose their own mates based on fleeting passion leads only to the dilution of superior traits. I have been placed in this position of influence to guide these choices, to ensure that each generation improves upon the last. They cannot see the grand design as I can, but they will benefit from my vision nonetheless. As Sheriff Hargrove's investigation deepened, even more disturbing evidence emerged. A second hidden room contained medical equipment and what appeared to be a surgical area. Records indicated that Montgomery, who had received some medical training in his youth, though never completed his studies, had performed procedures on at least 17 women in the community under the guise of treating various female complaints. These procedures, described in clinical detail in his notes, appeared designed to affect fertility, enhancing it in women from desirable lines and preventing it in those he deemed unsuitable for propagation. I cannot bring myself to describe in detail what I found in that room, wrote Dr. James Whitaker, the county physician called to examine the evidence. Suffice it to say that Montgomery possessed surgical tools of both conventional and custom design, and his journals indicate a practicing knowledge of reproductive anatomy that goes beyond what most trained physicians of our day possess. The implications of what occurred in that room are too horrifying to commit to paper. As news of the discovery spread, the community of Hickory Falls was thrown into chaos. Families who had lived as neighbors for decades suddenly questioned the very foundations of their relationships. Young couples discovered that their chance meetings had been orchestrated years in advance. Parents realized that the scholarships and opportunities that had sent their children away from Hickory Falls had been Montgomery's way of culling what he considered undesirable elements from his human garden. My father broke down when the sheriff showed him our family's page in Montgomery's book, recalled Sarah Jenkins in an oral history recorded in 1920. There it was in black and white, how my grandmother had been selected as a match for my grandfather because of her childbearing hips and docile temperament, to how my mother had been noted as showing excellent potential for producing intelligent sons, and how my own name was already linked with the youngest son of the Miller family. Though I was only 15 when Montgomery died, I was meant to marry him the following spring. The most terrible part was realizing it would have happened. My parents had already begun encouraging me to spend time with the Miller boy. The investigation took an even darker turn when authorities began examining the deaths of Montgomery's 4 wives. Each had died before the age of 30, and each death had been attributed to natural causes or complications of childbirth. Montgomery's records, however, told a different story. All 4 women had been selected based on their superior traits, and all 4 had apparently failed to produce the heirs Montgomery desired. His clinical notes suggested that at least 2 had been subjected to experimental fertility treatments that likely contributed to their deaths. It is with great disappointment that I must consider the experiment with subject wife 3 a failure, Montgomery wrote after the death of his 3rd wife, Elizabeth. Despite her excellent bloodlines and physical constitution, She has proven unable to carry a child past the 4th month. The treatments have taxed her system beyond recovery. I shall make arrangements for a respectable period of mourning before selecting subject wife 4, who will need to be younger, perhaps no older than 20, to ensure maximum fertility. As the investigation expanded beyond Hickory Falls, authorities discovered correspondence between Montgomery and like-minded men in other states. Letters found in his study revealed connections to early eugenics enthusiasts in Virginia, South Carolina, and Mississippi. These communications suggested that Montgomery's experiment in Hickory Falls was being observed and potentially replicated elsewhere, part of a broader movement that would later evolve into the American eugenics movement of the early 20th century. "Our work proceeds in parallel paths," wrote a correspondent identified only as J.W. from Richmond, Virginia. "Your controlled community offers advantages my position cannot, though my access to medical facilities provides benefits your rural setting lacks. I eagerly await the results of your 3rd-generation pairings. My own experiments have been limited to influencing matches within the highest social circles, but the dilution from outside bloodlines remains a persistent problem." The investigation also uncovered evidence that Montgomery had been collecting hair, blood and tissue samples from community members under various pretexts. Church records showed that he had established a tradition of taking a lock of hair from each newborn during christening ceremonies, supposedly as a blessing ritual he had brought from Virginia. His medical notes revealed that these samples were carefully catalogued and studied, with detailed observations about the quality of different family lines. "The decline in the Harrison line is now evident in the 3rd generation," Montgomery noted in an entry from 1870. "The hair samples show the once vibrant auburn color has dulled considerably, and the texture has become coarse. The introduction of the maternal Stuart bloodline has not produced the improvements I anticipated. The remaining Harrison children should be encouraged to seek opportunities outside Hickory Falls, while the Stuart line should be redirected toward the promising Wilson family to correct this regression. Most disturbing were the implications for the living residents of Hickory Falls. Montgomery's records included plans extending decades into the future, with proposed matches for children not yet born, and strategies for manipulating family lines well into the 20th century. Many prominent families discovered that their positions in the community had been secured by their compliance, conscious or unconscious, with Montgomery's grand design. "I can no longer look my neighbors in the eye," wrote Reverend Thomas Blackwood in his letter of resignation from the Hickory Falls Baptist Church in October 1878. "For 15 years I have performed marriages in this community, believing I was joining young people in holy matrimony according to God's will. Now I discover I was merely an unwitting tool in Montgomery's ungodly experiment. The sanctity of those unions is now questioned, and my role in enabling his vision weighs heavily on my soul. The legal system of 1878 was ill-equipped to address the complex ethical violations uncovered in Hickory Falls. No laws specifically prohibited arranged marriages or the kind of social manipulation Montgomery had practiced. The evidence of medical procedures performed without proper training was concerning but difficult to prosecute decades after the fact, especially with the primary suspect deceased. The investigation instead focused on determining whether any living individuals had been conscious collaborators in Montgomery's scheme. "I interviewed over 50 residents of Hickory Falls," reported State Investigator Martin Collins. "Many expressed horror and betrayal upon learning of Montgomery's plans, yet a few senior members of the community displayed a curious lack of surprise. The current mayor, who served as Montgomery's personal secretary for 12 years, claimed complete ignorance of the hidden rooms and records, though his own marriage exactly matched a pairing predicted in Montgomery's notes from 10 years prior. The evidence is circumstantial, but suggests at least some level of awareness among the town's leadership. As autumn deepened in 1878, Hickory Falls faced an unprecedented crisis of identity. Families that discovered they had been manipulated into unions questioned the very foundation of their relationships. Children wondered if they were the products of love or of Montgomery's calculated breeding program. The community's trust in its institutions, the church, local government, and social organizations, all established or heavily influenced by Montgomery, was shattered. When you build your life on what you believe is solid ground, then discover it's been quicksand all along, what do you do? Asked Eleanor Wilson in a letter to her sister who had moved to Tennessee years earlier. James and I have been married 18 years. We have 5 beautiful children. Now we learn that our meeting at the Harvest Festival wasn't chance, that Thaddeus Montgomery arranged for me to spill punch on James's new suit, knowing he would help clean it, knowing his gentleman's nature would ensure he would call on me after. Our entire life together was someone else's plan. Does that make our love any less real? I don't know anymore. The discovery in Hickory Falls remained largely contained to Alabama, with only brief mentions in newspapers in Montgomery and Birmingham. The sensational nature of the story competed with the ongoing challenges of Reconstruction, and the families involved worked to limit public exposure. The state authorities, concerned about the reputation of Alabama at a time when Northern perceptions were already negative, seemed content to let the matter fade from public attention. By December 1878, Sheriff Hargrove had compiled all evidence and submitted a final report to the state authorities. His conclusions were somber. Thaddeus Montgomery, through position and influence rather than force, effectively controlled the social and genetic development of an entire community for over 30 years. While his actions violated numerous moral and ethical boundaries, they largely operated within the letter of the law as it currently exists. His death has ended the direct manipulation of Hickory Falls development, but the consequences of his actions will continue to reverberate through generations yet unborn. What the sheriff could not have anticipated was how Montgomery's influence would continue even after his schemes were exposed. As the initial shock faded, the community found itself divided between those who wanted to dismantle everything associated with Montgomery's vision and those who, despite the disturbing revelations, still took pride in being part of what they now viewed as a unique heritage. There's a peculiar reaction setting in among some families, observed schoolteacher Harriet Gibson in her journal in January 1879. Those whose bloodlines Montgomery ranked most highly have begun to speak of it as a perverse sort of honor. I overheard Mrs. Sutton telling her daughter that being from one of the chosen lines meant she had a responsibility to marry well. The very ideology we claim to abhor is being reframed as a mark of distinction. I fear Montgomery's shadow may be longer than we realized. The community's struggle with its founder's legacy was complicated by practical considerations. Montgomery's will had left most of the town's commercial buildings, the school and the church property, in a trust controlled by a board of the very families he had most favored in his breeding program. Economic realities made a complete break from his influence nearly impossible without destroying the town itself. As winter settled over Hickory Falls, a tentative normalcy began to return. Families continued their daily lives. Children attended school, and Sunday services resumed at the Baptist church under a new pastor. Yet beneath this veneer of recovery, something had fundamentally changed in the community's DNA. Not the genetic manipulation Montgomery had envisioned, but a psychological inheritance perhaps more powerful than any physical trait. I watch the young people at social gatherings now, wrote Sheriff Hargrove in a personal letter dated March 1879. They are more careful around each other, more suspicious of coincidence. When attraction sparks between a young man and woman, I see them hesitate, wondering if their feelings are truly their own or the result of some grand design set in motion decades ago by a man they never knew. Montgomery may be dead, but his greatest achievement might be this. He has made an entire community question the authenticity of their most basic human connections. What few outside the immediate investigation knew was that not all of Montgomery's records had been made public. A series of coded journals, discovered in a secondary hidden compartment, remained sealed by state authorities. These documents, according to limited official correspondence, contained predictions and plans extending into the early 20th century. Marriages, births and deaths mapped out for generations yet unborn. The final phase cannot be implemented until the third generation reaches maturity. Read one partially deciphered passage. By then, the preliminary bloodlines will have been sufficiently refined to begin the true work. The visible traits are merely the beginning. The essential qualities, intelligence, moral character, leadership, These require careful cultivation over multiple generations. What I build here will be a monument not of stone, but of flesh and blood, a living testament that will endure long after my name is forgotten. As spring brought new life to Hickory Falls in 1879, residents made a conscious effort to move beyond the shadow of Thaddeus Montgomery. The town council voted to rename several streets and buildings that had honored their founder. The annual Founders' Day celebration was cancelled indefinitely. Public displays attempted to reclaim the community's identity from the man who had shaped it for so long. Yet even as these symbolic gestures suggested healing, subtle patterns began to emerge that echoed Montgomery's designs. Marriages continued to follow the bloodlines he had favored, now justified as maintaining respectable family connections. Children who displayed traits Montgomery had deemed undesirable still found themselves subtly marginalized. The social hierarchy he had engineered proved resilient, adapting to survive even the exposure of its artificial origins. "There's talk of sealing all the records," Deputy Reynolds confided to his brother in April 1879. "Not destroying them. No one has the stomach for that kind of erasure, but locking them away where they won't continue to poison daily life here. The mayor says it's for healing, but I can't help wondering if it's really about forgetting, about allowing certain patterns to continue without the uncomfortable reminder of where they came from." By the summer of 1879, most visible signs of the investigation had faded from Hickory Falls. The Montgomery estate remained vacant, its contents removed for examination by state authorities. The hidden rooms had been sealed, though rumors persisted that not all passages had been discovered. Life had resumed its rhythms, yet something fundamental had shifted in the community's understanding of itself. "We are like actors who have suddenly glimpsed the script," wrote Eleanor Wilson. "We continue to play our parts, speak our lines, hit our marks, but with the unsettling awareness that our performance was written by another hand. Does knowing the script make us more free or less? Can we improvise now, or are we still bound by the story set in motion all those years ago?" For the families of Hickory Falls, these questions would linger for generations, a psychological inheritance passed down alongside the physical traits so carefully cultivated by their town's founder. The full impact of Thaddeus Montgomery's 3-decade experiment would not be measured in genetic outcomes, but in the complex legacy of doubt, identity, and belonging that would shape the community long after his death. What Montgomery could not have anticipated was how exposure would transform his experiment from a controlled scientific endeavor into something more akin to mythology, a founding narrative that would continue to shape the town in ways both visible and invisible, acknowledged and denied. "I sometimes wonder if we haven't all become participants in a different kind of experiment now," Sheriff Hargrove confessed in his final note on the case. "One where we test whether knowledge itself can be buried, whether truth once unearthed can be returned to the ground. The people of Hickory Falls are attempting something unprecedented, to know their history and yet somehow live as if they don't. I cannot predict the outcome, but I suspect Thaddeus Montgomery would find this development the most fascinating of all." As summer turned to autumn and the 1-year anniversary of Montgomery's death approached, an uneasy peace had settled over Hickory Falls. The most sensational aspects of the case had faded from public discussion, replaced by a careful silence that passed for healing. Yet in quiet conversations, in private correspondence, in the careful observation of community patterns, the question remained: had Montgomery's experiment truly ended with his death and the exposure of his plans, or had it simply entered a new, more subtle phase? Have you ever wondered what secrets lie buried in the history of your hometown? What if the founding myths you learned as a child were carefully constructed to hide truths too terrible to acknowledge? For the residents of Hickory Falls, Alabama, these questions became a haunting reality that would span generations, extending far beyond the initial shock of 1878. The second chapter of this disturbing history begins in 1923, 45 years after the exposure of Thaddeus Montgomery's breeding program. By then, Hickory Falls had established a new narrative for itself, a prosperous southern town known for its unusually well-educated population, low crime rate, and strong family values. The Montgomery scandal had been relegated to whispered folklore, the documentation locked away in county archives. accessible only with special permission and generally avoided by all but the most determined researchers. Dr. Elizabeth Hargrove, granddaughter of the sheriff, who had uncovered Montgomery's secret rooms, returned to Hickory Falls that spring after completing her medical education at Johns Hopkins University. One of the few women in her graduating class, Dr. Hargrove had specialized in the emerging field of genetics, her interest unconsciously shaped by the stories her grandfather had shared in her youth. "I arrived in Hickory Falls on April 17th, 1923, Dr. Hargrove wrote in her private journal. Though I had visited occasionally as a child, returning as an adult with the knowledge of what had happened here gave the town an entirely new aspect. I found myself studying faces on the street, noting familial resemblances, wondering how much of what I observed was the natural course of small-town intermarriage and how much was the deliberate design of a man dead for nearly half a century." Dr. Hargrove had officially returned to establish a medical practice, but her personal journals reveal a secondary purpose: to examine the long-term outcomes of Montgomery's experiment. With her training in genetics and access to both medical records and her grandfather's personal notes on the case, she was uniquely positioned to investigate whether the controlled bloodlines had produced the effects Montgomery had anticipated. "The town presents a fascinating case study," she noted after 3 months of observation. "On a surface level, there are indeed patterns that appear statistically significant. Above average height in certain family lines, distinctive facial features that have remained consistent across generations, even aptitudes for music or mathematics that seem to follow specific bloodlines. Yet determining whether these represent the success of Montgomery's program or simply the natural concentration of traits in a relatively isolated population presents a significant scientific challenge." What Dr. Hargrove discovered in her careful examination of town records was both less and more disturbing than she had anticipated. Montgomery's breeding program, based on 19th century understanding of heredity, had largely failed to produce the superior specimens he had envisioned. The physical and intellectual traits he had tried to enhance showed normal variation across the community. However, what had persisted was something Montgomery himself might not have recognized as his legacy: a social structure that continued to reinforce his designed hierarchies. The true success of Montgomery's experiment was not biological but sociological, Dr. Hargrove wrote in notes never published during her lifetime. He created a community where certain families were positioned as natural leaders, where specific pairings were seen as good matches for reasons no one quite articulated, and where those who didn't fit the unspoken template were subtly encouraged to seek opportunities elsewhere. Even with full knowledge of his manipulations, the community has internalized his design to such a degree that they perpetuate it. Unconsciously, Dr. Hargrove's observations might have remained private, reflections had it not been for a disturbing discovery. In the summer of 1923, while renovating the old courthouse to install electric lighting, workers discovered a sealed metal box inside a wall cavity. The container, addressed to the town leadership of Hickory Falls Anno Domini 1925, contained a letter from Thaddeus Montgomery and a set of sealed envelopes. "To those who now guide my community," the letter began, "if you are reading these words, then the plans I set in motion continue to unfold as designed. By now, Hickory Falls will have emerged as a superior community, distinguished by the quality of its citizenry and the excellence of its bloodlines. The work of 3 generations has laid the foundation for what must now advance to its final stage." The letter went on to outline what Montgomery called the Great Culmination, a series of specific marriages that he insisted must take place in 1925 and 1926 between descendants of his original selected families. These unions, he claimed, would bring together the refined bloodlines he had cultivated to produce what he termed the perfected generation. The sealed envelopes contained the names of individuals, most of whom were, in 1923, young adults in their early 20s, the great-grandchildren of the original residents of Hickory Falls. "I was called to the mayor's office when the box was opened," Dr. Hargrove recorded. The current mayor, Robert Wilson, appeared physically ill as he read Montgomery's instructions. "This is madness," he kept saying. "Pure madness." Yet I noticed he did not immediately destroy the documents, instead locking them in his desk drawer before dismissing me. When I suggested alerting the named individuals about this disturbing discovery, he became quite agitated, insisting that reopening old wounds would serve no purpose. What followed was a quiet power struggle within Hickory Falls leadership. Dr. Hargrove advocated for transparency, arguing that the young people named in Montgomery's documents had the right to know they were part of a continuing experiment. Mayor Wilson and several prominent citizens, all Dr. Hargrove noted, descendants of families most favored in Montgomery's original hierarchy, insisted that the discovery should be suppressed to avoid unnecessarily distressing the community. I cannot escape the suspicion that their concern is less for community peace than for community control, Dr. Hargrove confided to her journal. The names in those envelopes represent the children of Hickory Falls's most influential families. To reveal Montgomery's continuing influence would threaten not only personal relationships, but the very power structure of the E-town. The debate became moot when the mayor's office was broken into 2 nights later. The sealed envelopes were stolen, while more valuable items were left untouched. No culprit was ever identified, though Dr. Hargrove's journals express her belief that the theft was orchestrated by those who wished to use the information rather than suppress it. I observed Martha Sutton and Carolyn Wilson at the Founders' Day picnic, she wrote in August 1923. Both were named in Montgomery's envelopes, matched to sons of the Blackwood and Miller families, respectively. Both young women were seated with precisely these young men, their parents hovering nearby with expressions of transparent satisfaction. When I attempted to engage Martha in conversation about her plans after graduation, her mother swiftly intervened, noting that a girl with Martha's background naturally has her future secured right here in Hickory Falls. Over the next 18 months, Dr. Hargrove documented a disturbing pattern. Of the 12 matches specified in Montgomery's letters, 9 appeared to be proceeding exactly as he had planned. Young people who had shown little previous interest in one another were suddenly keeping company, their courtships encouraged by families who had seemingly forgotten or chosen to ignore the dark history behind such arrangements. I confronted Reverend Blackwood today, Dr. Hargrove recorded in February 1924. His son Thomas is engaged to Martha Sutton, exactly as Montgomery prescribed. When I reminded him that his own father had resigned his ministry in 1878 in protest of Montgomery's manipulation, he became defensive. That was different, he insisted. Thomas and Martha chose each other freely. When I asked if he was certain of that, given the stolen envelopes and his position as head of the church Montgomery founded, he asked me to leave his office. Dr. Hargrove's growing isolation within the community was documented in her increasingly bitter journal entries. As a single woman pursuing a medical career, she already stood outside the traditional social structures of 1920s Alabama. Her questioning of the patterns she observed further alienated her from town leadership. Yet she persisted in her documentation, creating a parallel record to Montgomery's original notes, a chronicle of how his vision continued to shape the community decades after his death. "I am ostracized now," she wrote in September 1924. "My medical practice dwindles as families choose the older Dr. Reynolds, despite his outdated methods. I am no longer invited to social functions where these carefully orchestrated courtships are displayed. Yet I continue my observations from a distance. I cannot prove that these young people are being manipulated into fulfilling Montgomery's design, but the statistical improbability of 9 specific matches occurring naturally cannot be ignored." In the spring of 1925, exactly as Montgomery had predicted in his letter, the marriages began. Thomas Blackwood wed Martha Sutton in April. James Miller and Caroline Wilson married in May. Throughout the summer and fall, the pattern continued, each ceremony presented as a joyous union of prominent Hickory Falls families, each following the blueprint laid out 50 years earlier by Thaddeus Montgomery. I attended the Blackwood-Sutton wedding as an uninvited observer, standing at the back of the church, Dr. Hargrove recorded. The bride was radiant, the groom beaming. The families exuded pride and satisfaction. All appeared the very picture of a natural, joyful union. Yet I could not help but see the invisible hand of Montgomery guiding the proceedings. The same minister, the same church, even similar floral arrangements to those described in Montgomery's journals for the marriages he arranged generations ago. Tradition, they would call it. Design, I would counter. Dr. Hargrove's concerns might have remained the obsessive documentation of an isolated physician had it not been for a disturbing discovery in December 1925. Called to attend the sudden illness of Caroline Miller, née Wilson, Dr. Hargrove discovered the young woman suffering from symptoms she couldn't immediately diagnose. Further examination revealed evidence of some type of injection. Caroline was delirious with fever, Dr. Hargrove noted. When I questioned her about any medications, she mentioned the treatments that her mother-in-law had been administering. "For fertility," she whispered. "A family recipe. Upon examining her arm, I found multiple injection sites poorly administered. When I confronted Mrs. Miller Sr., she became defensive, claiming it was just herbs and vitamins that had been used in the family for generations. The composition she described bore a disturbing resemblance to the fertility treatments documented in Montgomery's medical notes. Further, investigation revealed that similar treatments were being administered to several of the new brides, all from formulations allegedly passed down through family lines, or with the stated purpose of ensuring healthy offspring. Laboratory analysis of samples Dr. Hargrove managed to obtain showed compounds that, while primitive by 1920s medical standards, followed the basic principles of the hormonal treatments Montgomery had documented in his experimental notes. "The implications are staggering," Dr. Hargrove wrote. "Not only have the social patterns of Montgomery's design persisted, but the specific medical interventions he developed have been preserved and passed down, disguised as folk remedies and family traditions. These young women are being subjected to the same dangerous treatments that likely contributed to the deaths of Montgomery's wives, administered by well-meaning family members who may not fully understand their origin or risks." Dr. Hargrove's attempts to alert authorities outside Hickory Falls met with little success. Her letters to medical colleagues in Birmingham and Montgomery were politely acknowledged but not acted upon. Her more direct appeals to state health officials were countered by communications from Hickory Falls leadership portraying her as a troubled woman whose medical practice was failing and who had developed obsessive theories about the community. "I am effectively silenced," she wrote in February 1926. The very isolation that Montgomery designed into Hickory Falls, geographic, social, and psychological, serves now to protect the continuation of his work. From the outside, all appears normal, even exemplary. A close-knit community of prosperous, healthy citizens. Who would believe that beneath this veneer lies a multi-generational eugenics experiment still in progress? By the summer of 1926, the first children of these arranged marriages began to arrive. Dr. Hargrove, though ostracized, maintained enough of a medical practice to hear reports of the births. Her notes record her mixed feelings: relief that the mothers had survived the dangerous fertility treatments, concern for the children who represented the next generation of Montgomery's design. "The Miller infant, a boy, is reportedly exceptional," she wrote. "Born with a full head of the golden hair that Montgomery so prized in the Wilson line, unusually alert and strong for a newborn. The family is ecstatic, viewing the child's robust health as validation of their traditional practices. I cannot help but wonder, is this simply a healthy child blessed with good genes, or is it the culmination of Montgomery's 70-year plan? And what expectations will be placed on this child as he grows?" As 1926 progressed, Dr. Hargrove documented the births of 8 children from the marriages Montgomery had prescribed. All were healthy, all were celebrated within the community with an intensity that struck her as excessive, even for a small town where births were typically communal events. Most disturbing to her was the language used to describe these infants: perfect specimens, superior stock, the finest examples of Hickory Falls heritage. "They speak of these children in terms that echo Montgomery's journals," she noted, "not with the crude scientific racism of his era, but with a more subtle language of exceptionalism. These infants are already being positioned as special, as destined for leadership, as the natural inheritors of the community's highest positions. The pattern repeats, generation after generation." In October 1926, Dr. Hargrove made her most disturbing discovery. Called to treat an elderly patient, Mabel Jenkins, who had served as housekeeper to several prominent Hickory Falls families, she found the woman in the final stages of what appeared to be liver failure. Believing herself to be dying, Jenkins made a confession that confirmed Dr. Hargrove's worst suspicions. She was lucid despite her condition, Dr. Hargrove recorded. She took my hand and said, "I need to unburden myself before I meet my maker." She then described how, as a young woman in 1878, she had been part of a group that had removed certain documents from Montgomery's study before the sheriff's investigation. These papers, which included formulas for his medical treatments and specific instructions for future generations, had been distributed among 5 trusted families, all named in Montgomery's preferred bloodlines. Jenkins described a secret society that had formed in the aftermath of Montgomery's death, dedicated to continuing what they called the Shepherd's Vision, initially small, consisting of just those who had most benefited from Montgomery's social engineering. The group had preserved his more detailed instructions, passing them down through the generations, while maintaining the public fiction that Montgomery's influence had ended with the 1878 investigation. "We thought we were special," Jenkins whispered, according to Dr. Hargrove's account. "Chosen. He made us believe we were part of something greater than ourselves. Even after we knew how he'd manipulated us, some couldn't let go of the idea that they were superior, that their bloodlines were worth preserving at any cost. It became like a religion to them." Jenkins died the following day, her confession providing Dr. Hargrove with the missing pieces of a puzzle she had been assembling for 3 years. The society Jenkins had described explained how Montgomery's influence had persisted so precisely, how the specific matches he had designated for 1925 had been implemented, and how his medical formulations had survived in the guise of family traditions. "I now understand that I am not documenting the unconscious persistence of social patterns," Dr. Hargrove wrote after Jenkins' funeral. "I am witnessing the deliberate continuation of Montgomery's experiment by those who have embraced his vision as their heritage and birthright. The question remains, how far does this conspiracy extend and what is its ultimate goal?" The answer came in December 1926, when Dr. Hargrove was approached by a young man named Michael Cooper, a clerk at the county records office. Cooper, whose family had lived in Hickory Falls since its founding, but had never been among Montgomery's preferred bloodlines, had been researching his own genealogy when he discovered documents that disturbed him. "Cooper showed me county birth and death records dating back to 1860, Dr. Hargrove noted. He had compiled statistics that revealed a pattern even I had not recognized. While the prominent families, those in Montgomery's program, showed normal birth rates and declining infant mortality consistent with improving medical care, families outside the preferred bloodlines showed a different pattern. Their birth rates had steadily declined over 70 years, while infant mortality remained higher than would be expected. The statistical deviation was subtle but unmistakable once identified. Further, investigation by Dr. Hargrove and Cooper uncovered evidence that the midwives and physicians serving Hickory Falls over the decades had been selectively providing different levels of care. Preferred families received the best available medical attention, while subtle neglect and occasionally deliberate malpractice affected the reproductive outcomes of those Montgomery had designated as undesirable lines. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence, too widespread to be the work of a single practitioner. "The implications are genocidal," Dr. Hargrove wrote in January 1927. "Over 3 generations, the population balance of Hickory Falls has been deliberately shifted through differential medical care, manipulated marriage patterns, and economic pressures. Montgomery's preferred bloodlines now represent nearly 70% of the town's population, compared to approximately 30% in 1878. His vision of a purified community is being realized not through overt violence, but through persistent, generational pressure on reproductive outcomes." Dr. Hargrove and Cooper spent the winter of 1927 gathering evidence, planning to present their findings to state authorities in a form that could not be dismissed as the theories of a disgruntled physician. Their work was cut short on March 15th, when Michael Cooper was found dead in his home, apparently from suicide by hanging. A note in his handwriting expressed remorse for spreading unfounded rumors about Hickory Falls founding families and asked forgiveness for his mental instability. Cooper was not suicidal, Dr. Hargrove recorded emphatically. He was excited about our research, convinced that we would eventually bring the truth to light. The handwriting on the note matches his records, but the phrasing is entirely inconsistent with his speech patterns and beliefs. I am now certain that we face not merely a conspiracy of tradition, but one willing to use violence to protect its secrets. Fearing for her own safety, Dr. Hargrove compiled her research, including her grandfather's personal notes, her own medical observations, and Cooper's statistical analysis, into a comprehensive document. She sent copies to colleagues in New York, Boston, and Chicago, with instructions that they be opened only in the event of her death or disappearance. She then continued her practice in Hickory Falls, maintaining the appearance of having abandoned her investigation, while secretly documenting the continuing patterns she observed. "I remain because someone must witness," she wrote in April 1927. The children born of Montgomery's designed marriages are now toddlers, already being treated as special, already being prepared for their role in the continuing experiment. Behind closed doors, I suspect plans are already being made for their eventual marriages, for the next iteration of Montgomery's grand design. The cycle continues, and I fear what the ultimate outcome may be if it remains unchallenged. Dr. Hargrove's journal entries become more sporadic after the spring of 1927. Her medical practice continued to dwindle, and social isolation took an evident toll on her perspective. Her later entries show increasing paranoia, though given the documented events preceding them, distinguishing justified fear from excessive anxiety becomes difficult. "I am watched constantly," she wrote in June 1927. "Patients who still come to me are questioned afterward about our conversations. My mail shows signs of tampering. Last night, I'm certain someone entered my home while I was making a house call. Nothing was taken, but my papers had been disturbed. They know I am keeping records. They are assessing what I know and what evidence I have." In October 1927, Dr. Hargrove made her final journal entry. "I have received an invitation to the home of Mayor Wilson this evening, the first social overture from town leadership in nearly 4 years. The stated purpose is to heal old divisions and discuss my valuable role in the community's medical future. I am not naive enough to believe this sudden reconciliation is genuine, yet I will attend. To refuse would only confirm their suspicions that I continue to investigate. I have taken precautions. All my documentation is secured with my attorneys in Birmingham, with instructions for their use should anything happen to me. Whatever Montgomery's followers intend, they cannot erase the evidence I have compiled." Dr. Elizabeth Hargrove disappeared that night. Her home was found empty the next morning, her medical bag and coat missing, suggesting she had left to attend a patient. Mayor Wilson confirmed she had never arrived at his home for the scheduled meeting. A search of the surrounding countryside revealed no trace of her. The official conclusion was that she had left Hickory Falls voluntarily, a theory supported by the discovery that she had withdrawn a significant sum from her bank account 2 days earlier. "We regret Dr. Hargrove's decision to leave our community," Mayor Wilson was quoted in the county newspaper. While her medical skills were appreciated, her increasingly troubled state of mind had become a concern to many. "We wish her well in her future endeavors, wherever they may take her." The sealed packets Dr. Hargrove had left with attorneys in Birmingham were never opened. According to limited records from the law firm, a woman claiming to be Elizabeth Hargrove appeared 3 weeks after her disappearance, withdrew the documents, and closed her account with the firm. The attorney who handled the transaction later admitted he had never met Dr. Hargrove in person before this encounter, and had verified her identity solely through her knowledge of the account details and possession of appropriate identification.